The IV drip beeped its final warning. 48 hours left. I clutched the encrypted hard drive, my last chance to secure Marcus's future. The process server's fist slammed against my hospital door, hunting debts that weren't mine. One signature stood between life and ruin. Then the doctor's words cut deeper than any scalpel. The forms were forged. He never agreed. The screen flickered with the truth. My best friend's betrayal, inked in someone else's hand. The hard drive hummed in my grip, the only proof I had left. The clock wasn't just ticking, it was laughing. The scent of sterile latex and scorched coffee hung heavy in the humid air of the Evanston Hospital suite. David Miller gripped the heavy fountain pen, his knuckles white against his pale skin. On the rolling bedside tray, the legal transfer documents crinkled under the weight of his shaking hand. Robert Henderson leaned in, his breath smelling of peppermint and anxiety, pointing a manicured finger at the final signature line. "The inheritance," Robert whispered, his voice a low rasp against the hum of the air conditioner. "Every cent of the estate goes to Marcus. The Evanston house, the offshore holdings, the physical assets. Everything." David counted the stairs in his mind. 1, 2, 3. He needed the world to stay still. He scribbled his name, the nib digging deep into the expensive bond paper. Ink spat across the line like a dark bruise. He shoved the folder toward Robert, his chest tightening behind the thin cotton of his hospital gown. He was building a fortress for Marcus, a financial wall that would protect his friend long after David's own heart stopped rhythmic thumping. He could feel the weight of his legacy, a structure of steel and math, transferring from his dying hands into the future. "It's done," David wheezed, the sound of the pen hitting the tray echoing like a gavel. 58 years of building, Robert. All of it for him. He's the only one left who knows the code of the house. The heavy oak door swung open, the brass handle clattering against the wall with a violence that made David's heart skip a beat. A man in a rumpled, sweat-stained suit marched in, clutching a red-stamped folder. He ignored Robert's indignant protest and lunged for the silver laptop sitting on the nightstand, the machine that held the digital keys to every vault David owned. "Mr. Miller, this device is collateral for the Thorn debt." The server grunted, his fingers snapping around the aluminum casing. His breath smelled of cheap tobacco and desperation. "Marcus Thorn owes $3 million in defaulted commercial loans. The court says his associate's assets are fair game." David lunged from the bed, the IV pole shrieking against the linoleum floor like a dying animal. Cold metal bit into his palm as he threw his weight against the server, his fingers clawing at the laptop's smooth surface. The plastic casing groaned under the pressure. David's pulse thudded in his ears, a rhythmic drumming that drowned out Robert's shouting. He shoved his elbow into the man's ribs, a desperate, clumsy strike that felt like hitting a brick wall. "Mine," David wheezed, his lungs burning with the effort. "Get your hands off his future. This isn't Marcus's yet. It's my life. Get out." The server stumbled, his grip slipping as David pulled the machine against his chest, shielding the cold metal with his own brittle ribs. The man looked at the dying billionaire with a mix of pity and frustration before Robert shoved a legal injunction under his nose, forcing him back toward the door. David collapsed back onto the thin mattress, gasping, his fingers still fused to the laptop. Once the room was cleared of the intruder, David's shaking fingers flew across the keyboard. He didn't care about the pain in his side or the way the room tilted. He needed to see the green lights. He needed to hear the digital click of the locks falling into place. He typed a complex sequence of characters. Not a password, but a series of commands that diverted the flood of data into a secure, secondary vault. The screen flickered, a soft blue glow reflecting in his sunken eyes. The system recognized the command, like a heavy iron bolt sliding home in a thick door. Access granted. He watched the progress bar crawl across the screen, each percentage point representing a piece of his life being tucked away where no process server or creditor could reach it. He felt a surge of cold, clinical relief. The financial future of Marcus Thorne was now a locked box, and David held the only key. He leaned back, the 1, 2, 3 of his internal count slowing down. He had won. He had secured the legacy. The door opened again, but this time the movement was soft, calculated. Dr. Sarah Johnson entered the room. She didn't look at David. She looked at the heart monitor, her eyes tracking the jagged green line. She washed her hands, once, twice, 3 times. The sound of the scrubs sink a rhythmic splashing that filled the silence. "David," she said, her voice like ice hitting glass. She didn't use his title. She didn't offer a smile. She held a clipboard against her chest like a shield. "We have a problem with the transplant prep." David adjusted the cuff of his gown, trying to regain his composure. "The funds are cleared, Sarah. Marcus will be here for the pre-op. He's handling the logistics of the transition." Sarah stepped closer, the scent of antiseptic following her. "It's not the money, David. I've been reviewing the surgical consent forms Marcus supposedly signed at the lab yesterday. The ink density, the pressure of the stroke, the digital timestamp in the metadata of the scan." She paused, her gaze finally meeting his. "They're sophisticated forgeries, David. Whoever signed these spent a long time practicing your friend's handwriting. But they weren't Marcus Thorne. He never went to the lab. He never signed the consent for the procedure." The world tilted. David's mind raced, trying to find a mathematical explanation, a logical error in her data. "That's impossible. He gave me his word. He sat in that chair and told me he was ready." "The paper doesn't lie," Sarah said, her voice devoid of empathy. "He isn't coming, David. He never intended to." The silence that followed was heavier than the Chicago heat outside. David looked down at his laptop. The secure, encrypted vault he had fought so hard to protect. He had just handed the keys of his kingdom to a ghost who had no intention of saving the king. The weight of the news hit David like a physical blow to the stomach, sharper than the dull ache of his failing liver. He looked at the clock on the wall. Its red digital numbers pulsed with a predatory rhythm. 5, 6, 7. He needed to maintain the count, but the numbers were starting to blur. The door creaked open again, and 3 members of the hospital's surgical board filed in. They didn't sit. They stood at the foot of his bed, a wall of white coats and dark ties. The man in the center, Dr. Aris, checked his watch, a heavy gold piece that caught the flickering fluorescent light. "Mr. Miller," Aris began, his voice flat and professional. "We've reviewed the status of your donor. We are now 48 hours from the point of no return. If Marcus Thorne is not physically present in this building, processed through intake, and prepped for the procedure by sunset today, the surgical theater is released. We have a list of 24 other patients who are ready. We cannot hold the staff and the equipment for a ghost." "He's coming," David rasped, his voice cracking. He reached for his phone, his thumb hovering over Marcus's contact name. He's a busy man. He's managing the estate. The estate won't matter if you're dead, David." Robert Henderson interjected from the corner, his voice trembling. Robert was staring at his wife's grocery list, his fingers tracing the word milk over and over. "If he isn't here, the legal transfer I just processed becomes a gift to a man who lets you die. We have to find him." David ignored the bile rising in his throat. He opened the tracking app on his laptop, the one linked to Marcus's phone. He had installed it months ago, a safety measure they had laughed about over expensive scotch. The map of Chicago appeared, a grid of gray lines and blue water. He waited for the pulsing blue dot that represented Marcus. The screen remained blank. Signal lost. He turned it off. David whispered. A cold prickle danced across his skin. He diverted his search to the hospital's external security feed, bypassing the administrative blocks with a sequence of codes he'd memorized weeks ago. He searched the parking lot grid, looking for the sleek, cherry-red silhouette of his 1967 Mustang. He had lent it to Marcus this morning so his friend wouldn't have to take a cab. The space was empty. The asphalt where the Mustang should have been was a vacant gray rectangle. David watched the playback, rewinding the grainy footage. At 10:14 a.m., the Mustang had pulled out of the lot. The driver was wearing a hat, face obscured, but the rhythmic pop-pop-pop of knuckles against the steering wheel was visible even in the low-resolution video. Marcus hadn't just missed a meeting. He had harvested the first of David's physical treasures and vanished into the city. "He's gone," David said, the realization settling into his bones like lead. He took the car. He took the phone off the grid. "I'm a prisoner in a room I'm paying $10,000 a day for." As the board members filed out, their silence a death sentence, David noticed something on his nightstand that hadn't been there before. Nestled between a plastic water pitcher and a bottle of useless pills sat a single, blank electronic key. It was a black plastic fob, unlabeled, cold to the touch. David's heart hammered against his ribs. He called up the suite's internal security log on his laptop. He scrolled through the last hour, his eyes stinging. There. 10 minutes ago, while he was arguing with the process server, a figure in a blue maintenance jumpsuit had slipped into the room. The man hadn't fixed anything. He had stood over David's bed for exactly 12 seconds, placed the key on the stand, and walked out. The digital locks on the door, the ones David had trusted to keep the world out, hadn't even flickered. Someone had the master codes. Someone was moving through his sanctuary like a ghost. The presence of the key was a message. It wasn't a gift. It was a taunt. The room no longer felt like a high-end medical suite. It felt like a cage with a glass floor. David looked at the heavy oak door, then back at the blank key. He was being hunted in his own bed. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch as the afternoon sun dipped behind the Evanston skyline. David was alone, the hum of the machines, the only company for his counting. 12, 13, 14. The door opened softly. A man in a pale blue technician's scrub entered, carrying a tray of fresh IV bags. He was tall, his face masked by a surgical shield that reflected the room's sterile light. He didn't speak. He didn't look at David's chart. He moved with a mechanical precision that made the hair on David's neck stand up. "I didn't order a change," David said, his hand sliding toward the emergency call button. "Doctor's orders, Mr. Miller," the man replied, his voice a muffled, gravelly baritone. "Just a sedative to help with the tremors. You're looking a bit peaked." The man reached for the IV line, his gloved hand holding a syringe filled with a thick, milky fluid. David watched the man's eyes through the shield. They were flat, devoid of the practiced empathy of the nursing staff. As the man leaned over, David noticed a small, jagged scar running beneath his ear, and the scent of the man hit him. Not antiseptic, but the sharp, metallic tang of gun oil and old sweat. David didn't push the call button. He knew the response time was 3 minutes, and he didn't have 3 seconds. As the technician reached for the plastic port in David's arm, David swung his heavy laptop with every ounce of strength left in his wasted frame. The aluminum edge caught the man across the side of the head with a sickening thud. The syringe flew across the room, splashing the milky poison against the wall. The assassin roared, a guttural sound, and lunged across the bed. His hands, thick and calloused, clamped around David's throat. The air vanished. David's vision began to spark, 1,000 white lights exploding in the dark. His hand fumbled blindly across the bedside tray. His fingers closed around the cold, sharp handle of a surgical scalpel left behind from a dressing change. He didn't think. He didn't count. He drove the blade upward, into the soft tissue of the man's shoulder. The attacker shrieked, his grip loosening just enough for David to draw a ragged, burning breath. David stabbed again, a frantic, desperate motion, catching the man's forearm. Blood, dark and hot, sprayed across David's hospital gown. The man recoiled, clutching his arm, his eyes wide with shock. He hadn't expected the dying man to bite back. David lunged for the red emergency lever on the wall, yanking it down. A piercing wail erupted, the alarm's vibration rattling the floor and David's very teeth. The hospital technician didn't stay to finish the job. He turned and bolted, his heavy boots thudding against the linoleum as he vanished into the hallway. David collapsed against the pillows, the scalpel falling from his crimson-stained fingers. His chest heaved, each breath a jagged shard of glass. Security guards burst into the room seconds later, their voices a chaotic blur. But David couldn't hear them. He was staring at the milky white stain on the wall, the poison that was meant to end his story before the final chapter. "Mr. Miller! David!" a guard shouted, hands hovering over him. "Are you hit? Where did he go?" David pointed a shaking finger toward the door, but his strength was spent. He felt his consciousness fraying at the edges, the numbers in his head spinning out of control. 21, 22, 0. Just as the world began to fade into a dull gray, his phone buzzed on the mattress. It was Robert Henderson. David fumbled for the device, pressing it to his ear with a bloody hand. "David? David, listen to me." Robert's voice was a frantic, high-pitched scream. "I just got the forensic audit back from the hospital's charitable trust. The account is empty, David. Every cent of the $12 million for the new wing is gone." David tried to speak, but his throat was a desert. "Marcus," Robert continued, his voice breaking. "He used that limited power of attorney you gave him last month. The one you said was just for administrative oversight. He didn't just drain the fund, David. He routed the transfers through your personal server. He left a digital trail that leads straight to your bed. The feds are opening an embezzlement case, and you're the only name on the warrant. He didn't just steal your money, David. He turned you into a fugitive." The phone slipped from David's hand. He wasn't just a dying man anymore. He was a villain in a story he hadn't even written. Subverted. The news of the embezzlement hit David with more force than the assassin's hands. He sat upright, the adrenaline of the attack replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. He was a man of systems, and he knew how to fight a fire. He reached for his laptop, his fingers flying across the keys despite the blood drying on his knuckles. "Robert, listen to me," David whispered into the speakerphone. "I can fix this. The server logs. I have a secondary backup, a physical drive mirrored to the main system. If I can upload the raw data packets showing the origin point of the transfers, it will prove the commands came from Marcus's IP, not mine. I'm going to bypass the hospital's internal network and send it directly to the district attorney's office. I'll use the secure legal portal. It's a one-way street, Once it's in their system, Marcus can't touch it. David felt a surge of hope. This was what he did best. He found the flaw in the structure and reinforced it. He watched the transfer bar begin to fill. 10%, 30%, 70%. He could see the file names. Marcus_auth_log.dat, transfer_origin_trace.pdf. This was the smoking gun. He was handing the DA the rope to hang Marcus. "It's working, Robert," David said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "The evidence is uploading. In 5 minutes, the feds will have everything they need to clear my name and put a warrant out for him. I'm securing my legacy. I'm winning." The progress bar hit 100%. File received. Verification pending. David let out a long, shuddering breath. He leaned back against the pillows, his heart rate finally slowing. He had outplayed the predator. He had used his intelligence to build a bridge back to his own reputation. "I see it," Robert said on the other end, his voice sounding relieved. "The portal shows the delivery. I'm calling the DA's lead investigator now. We've got him, David. You did it." David closed his eyes for a second, savoring the small victory. But then, he heard a sound. A soft, rhythmic pop-pop-pop coming from the phone speaker. "Robert?" David asked, frowning. "What is that?" "What's what, David?" Robert's voice sounded different. The tremor was gone. It was replaced by a smooth, syrupy calm. David looked back at his laptop screen. The verification pending message flickered and changed. "Access denied. Credentials revoked by system administrator." "The portal, David," Robert said, and David could hear the sound of knuckles cracking again. Pop, pop. "You always said a man's legacy is only as secure as his oversight. But you forgot one thing. I've been your lawyer for 30 years. I'm the one who set up your secure legal portal. I'm the one with the master administrative key." David's blood ran cold. "Robert, what are you doing?" "I'm not the one doing anything, David," Robert said, his voice now dripping with a terrifying, practiced empathy. "I'm just watching the water find its own level. Marcus didn't just use your power of attorney. He used mine. We've been partners in this for a long time. That evidence you just uploaded? I didn't send it to the DA. I sent it to a private server in the Caymans, and then I wiped the original logs from your machine. But before I did, I added a little something extra. A digital signature from your laptop confirming that you initiated the deletion of the evidence. It looks like a guilty man trying to cover his tracks." David lunged for the keyboard, but the screen went black. A single line of white text appeared. "Goodbye, David." "You see?" Robert continued. "The hospital board is already on their way up with the police. They found the evidence of your embezzlement 10 minutes ago, the evidence I planted. Your little upload just confirmed the digital path. You didn't build a bridge, David. You built your own gallows. And the best part? Marcus is already at the airfield. He's waiting for me. We're going to spend your legacy together." The line went dead. David stared at the black screen, the reflection of his own pale, terrified face staring back at him. He had tried to be the smartest man in the room, and in doing so, he had handed his enemies the very tools they needed to destroy him. He wasn't just a fugitive. He was a footnote in Marcus and Robert's masterpiece. He had no money, no donor, and now, no defense. He was truly alone. The world began to blur at the edges, not from the lack of light, but from the systemic collapse of his own body. David felt a wave of nausea so intense it threatened to pull him off the bed. His vision doubled. The single fluorescent light overhead, becoming a pair of predatory eyes. 1, 2, 3. He tried to count, but the numbers felt like sand slipping through his fingers. The door opened, and Dr. Sarah Johnson marched in, followed by 2 burly security guards. Her face was a mask of clinical detachment, her posture rigid. She didn't look at the blood on the floor or the milky stain on the wall. She looked at the digital tablet in her hand. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice sounding like it was coming from the end of a long tunnel. "The board has reviewed the preliminary findings from the federal audit. Given the severity of the embezzlement charges and the risk to the hospital's reputation, your private suite privileges are revoked. Effective immediately, you are being discharged and transferred to the Cook County Medical Ward for detainees." I'm dying, Sarah," David wheezed, his hand clutching his side where the liver pain was a white-hot coal. "You can't. The surgery, there is no surgery," she snapped, washing her hands for the 3rd time with a violent, splashing rhythm. "The donor is a fugitive, the funds are gone, and you are a flight risk. The state facility will provide adequate end-of-life care. Guards, prep him for transport." David felt the bed being unlocked, the wheels squeaking against the floor. He tried to protest, but a sudden tremor racked his body, a violent shaking that made his teeth chatter. He looked at Sarah, pleading with his eyes, but she was already turning away, her mind already on the next chart, the next line item. She was washing her hands of him, literally and figuratively. They wheeled him into the service elevator, the cold air of the basement hitting him like a physical blow. The smell of diesel and damp concrete replaced the sterile hospital air. He was being discarded like medical waste. As they reached the loading dock, a man in a gray windbreaker stepped out from behind a concrete pillar. He was nondescript, the kind of man you'd pass on the street and forget a second later. He didn't look at the guards. He looked at the exits. James Wilson, the private investigator David had hired weeks ago as a redundancy. "Wait," James said, his voice low and steady. He stepped into the path of the gurney. The guards hesitated, confused by his sudden, quiet authority. "I have a delivery for the patient. Legal documents." He leaned over David, his breath smelling of stale coffee. He didn't offer a hand. He dropped a crumpled piece of paper onto David's chest. "I found him, David," James whispered, his eyes scanning the loading dock. The Mustang's GPS had a hardwired backup Marcus didn't know about. "He's at the Miller Rand Airfield in Indiana, Hangar 4. He's got a Gulfstream fueled and ready for a 9 p.m. departure. He's not waiting for Robert. He's leaving now." "Indiana," David rasped, the word a struggle. "I can't take you there, David," James said, backing away into the shadows. "I don't sit with my back to the door, and that airfield is a trap. But the coordinates are on that paper. If you want your pound of flesh, you'd better move. The world is closing in." James vanished before the guards could react. David looked at the paper, then at the transport van waiting at the end of the dock. The driver, a man named Christopher Brown, stood by the open rear doors, letting out a long, heavy sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the world. He was humming a low, mournful tune, a funeral dirge that made David's skin crawl. "All right, let's get this over with." Christopher sighed, his eyes fixed on the floor. "I've got 3 more of these runs tonight, and my wife's already calling about the mortgage." David gripped the edge of the gurney. He looked at his wrist, where his Patek Philippe watch, a masterpiece of gold and precision, glinted in the dim light. "It was worth more than the driver's house. Christopher," David whispered, his voice gaining a sudden, desperate strength. "Look at me." The driver looked up, his eyes tired and sunken. David unbuckled the watch and held it out, the gold links dangling like a lure. "This is $80,000 of Swiss engineering," David said. "It's yours. All you have to do is miss the turn for the county ward. Take me to the Miller Rand airfield. 1 hour. That's all I need." Christopher looked at the watch, then at the guards, who were distracted by a radio call. He let out another long sigh, his shoulders slumping even further. "I could lose my job, you know. End up on the street with nothing but a fancy watch I can't even sell without a receipt." He reached out and snatched the watch, shoving it into his pocket. "But I guess one more burden won't kill me. Get in and keep your mouth shut." The ambulance ride was a descent into a private hell. The siren wailed directly overhead, a piercing cry that vibrated through David's skull, drowning out the 1, 2, 3 of his internal count. The air in the back was hot and recycled, smelling of old bandages and the driver's cheap tobacco. Through the small, reinforced window, David watched the Chicago skyline recede, replaced by the flat, featureless darkness of the Indiana plains. Christopher was humming again. "Abide with me." The slow, haunting melody, a perfect soundtrack to David's collapse. David's vision was failing, the world turning into a smear of gray and black. He felt the ambulance slow down, the tires crunching over gravel. The vibration changed from the smooth hum of the highway to the rhythmic jarring of an unpaved road. They stopped. The rear doors creaked open, admitting a blast of cold, biting wind that smelled of aviation fuel and damp earth. David was wheeled out into the shadow of a massive, corrugated metal building. Hangar 4. The hangar was a cavern of echoes. The wind whistled through the gaps in the metal siding, a mournful howl that made David's ears ache. In the center of the vast, grease-stained floor sat a sleek private jet, its engines whining with a low, predatory hum. And there, standing by the boarding stairs, was Marcus Thorne. He looked perfect. He was wearing a bespoke navy suit, his hair neatly combed, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He wasn't counting. He wasn't shaking. He looked like a man who had already won. "David," Marcus said, his voice echoing through the hangar like a ghost. He didn't look surprised. He looked disappointed. "You always did have a flair for the dramatic. I expected you to die in that sterile little box, counting your breaths until the lights went out." Marcus stepped closer, the rhythmic crack-crack of his knuckles sounding like a death rattle in the vast space. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, silver pistol. He didn't point it yet. He just held it at his side, a casual accessory. "Why, Marcus?" David asked, his voice a dry rattle. 30 years. We built everything together." "We built nothing together, David," Marcus said, his smile never reaching his cold, blue eyes. "You built a cage of numbers and rules, and you expected me to live in it. I was your shadow, your best friend, the man who sat by your bed while you lectured me on legacy. Do you know how exhausting it is to pretend to care about a dying man's arithmetic for a decade?" Marcus leaned in, his breath smelling of expensive bourbon and the same peppermint Robert Henderson had used. "I've been grooming this payout since the day we met. Every crisis, every merger, every favor. It was all just a series of deposits into an account you didn't even know existed. And now, the account is full." "The surgery," David wheezed. "You gave me hope. You told me we were a match." Marcus laughed, a sharp, barking sound that echoed off the metal ribs of the ceiling. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. A lab report. He tossed it onto David's lap. "Look at the date, David. 6 months ago. The real results. We weren't even in the same blood group. I bribed the technician to swap the samples, to give you just enough hope to keep the pen moving on those transfer documents. There was never going to be a surgery. I wasn't going to give you my liver, David. I was just waiting for yours to finish rotting. Marcus raised the pistol, the barrel a dark, empty eye staring at David. And now, the board is clear. Robert is handling the final sweep in Chicago, and I'm taking your legacy to a place where the sun actually shines. You're penniless, David. You're a fugitive. And in 10 minutes, you'll be a cold body in a lonely hangar. David sat in his wheelchair, the weight of the betrayal pressing down on him harder than the gravity of his own death. He looked at the jet, then at Marcus, and finally at the hangar's ceiling. He saw the network of red pipes, the outdated ventilation fans, the industrial fire suppression canisters. He wasn't a doctor, and he wasn't a criminal. He was an architect. He knew how buildings breathed. He knew how they died. 1, 2, 3, David whispered, his lips moving silently. Still counting, David? Marcus mocked, stepping closer. Count to 10. That's all the time you have left. David's hand slipped into the side pocket of his wheelchair, his fingers closing around the blank electronic key the intruder had left in his room. It wasn't just a key. It was a master override for the hangar's maintenance system, a gift from James Wilson, who knew that information was a weapon. David didn't look at Marcus. He looked at the control panel on the wall 10 feet away. He didn't need to reach it. He just needed to trigger the signal. He pressed the button on the fob. A deep, resonant clunk echoed through the hangar. The overhead lights flickered and died, plunging the space into a chaotic, shifting darkness. And then, a sound like 1,000 angry snakes filled the air. So the halon gas fire suppression system triggered, a massive cloud of white, oxygen-depriving vapor erupting from the ceiling vents. It wasn't a fire. It was a flood of invisible weight. Marcus coughed, his eyes widening as the gas hit him. He fired a shot wildly into the dark, the flash of the muzzle a momentary spark in the fog. The bullet whined off a metal strut. He stumbled, the pistol slipping from his hand as he clawed at his throat, gasping for air that was no longer there. The pilot, caught near the jet's intake, collapsed instantly, his lungs unable to process the heavy, chemical mist. David pulled his hospital gown over his mouth and nose, his eyes stinging. He knew he only had a minute before the gas claimed him too. He used his remaining strength to wheel himself toward the hangar's communications console near the main door. His fingers, numb and shaking, flew across the keypad. He didn't call 911. He didn't call the police. He dialed a 20-digit number he had committed to memory years ago, the automated verification line for the Miller Estates Living Legacy Trust. Verification required, a cold, synthetic voice said through the speaker. David Miller, he gasped, his voice a ragged whisper. Code Alpha Niner 74. Activate Condition of Survival clause. Immediate freeze on all sub-accounts. Recipient failure to perform medical obligation. Processing. The machine replied. David watched Marcus through the haze. His former friend was on his knees, his face turning a sickly shade of purple, his manicured fingers scratching at the grease-stained floor. The jet's engines began to sputter and die, choked by the same gas that was killing the men. Clause activated, the voice said. All offshore transfers are flagged as incomplete gifts. Funds returned to primary holding, accounts frozen pending judicial review. David let the phone drop. He watched as the hangar doors were kicked open from the outside. A dozen figures in tactical gear swarmed in, their flashlights cutting through the halon fog like searchlights. Federal agents. They hadn't come for David. They had followed the digital breadcrumbs James Wilson had left for them, the trace of the Mustang's GPS, the signal from the airfield. "Freeze! Federal agents! Hands in the air!" Marcus tried to stand, to scream, to explain, but he had no breath left. He was tackled to the floor, his face pressed into the oil and dirt, his expensive suit ruined. He looked at David, his eyes filled with a primal, desperate rage. But David didn't look back. David felt the ambulance crew lifting him, the familiar vibration of the gurney, the scent of fresh, cold Indiana air hitting his face. He was back in a moving box. But the sirens didn't sound like a threat anymore. They sounded like a resolution. As the ambulance sped back toward the city, David looked out the rear window at the receding lights of the airfield. He felt a strange, hollow peace. He was penniless, yes. He was dying, certainly. But he was no longer a prisoner of his own legacy. He reached out and took the hand of the paramedic, a young man with kind eyes who didn't look at a chart or a tablet. He just held the hand of a dying man. "1," David whispered, his voice finally steady. "2, 3. He didn't need to count anymore. The world was finally predictable. At the memorial service 2 weeks later, the air in the Evanston chapel was filled with the scent of lilies and the quiet murmur of the city's elite. Robert Henderson was not there. He had been arrested at O'Hare trying to board a flight to Zurich. Marcus Thorne was in a federal holding cell, waiting for a trial that would strip him of everything but his name. Robert's successor, a young woman with sharp eyes and a clear voice, stood at the podium. She read the final addendum to David Miller's will, a document he had drafted in the back of a medical transport van, witnessed by a driver who had finally found something worth more than a gold watch. "The recovered funds," she read, her voice echoing through the silent hall, "totaling $42 million, are hereby redirected. They will not go to a house or a car or a private jet. They will fund the David Miller Transplant Wing at Chicago Memorial, a facility dedicated to the principle that a man's life is not a ledger to be balanced, but a gift to be shared." In the back of the room, Dr. Sarah Johnson stood against the wall. She didn't wash her hands. She just looked at the photograph of David on the altar, a man who had spent his final hours tearing down a fortress to build a bridge. And for the first time in 20 years, she felt the weight of a patient she couldn't save, and she didn't try to look away.